May I welcome on stage Davidar, Kapish Mehra, and Nilanjana Roy. Davidar was the head of Penguin India, who turned around its publishing program from a mere 6 titles in 1987 to 150 titles annually. In 2004, he relocated to Penguin, Canada, and is now the founder of the Aleph Book Company, established in May 2011 in partnership with Rupa Publication. He has written several acclaimed novels like The House of Blue Mangoes, The Solitude of Emperors, and Ithaca. It is also his birthday today. We would like to wish you a very happy birthday, sir. Next on stage is Kapish Mehra, who is the Managing Director of Rupa Publication and Aleph Book Company. Rupa and Company is one of India's largest English language trade publisher. We welcome you, sir. It's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Nilanjana Roy again. She is a journalist, a literary critic, and the author of The Wildings. She currently writes a regular column for the Business Standard. She used to write a notorious literary blog called The Kitab Khana under the pseudonym Hari Babu. Listen to them as they discuss a very pertinent question in contemporary Indian literature. Coexistence of commercial and literary writing in India is a myth or reality.
Thank you so much. Hello, is the mic working? Can you hear us? Okay. Could we get a third mic, please? And while we're waiting for the third mic, as you heard, it's Davidar's birthday. And could I ask you all to just stand up? I know you don't want to sing happy birthday all the way through, but just shout happy birthday, David. The man is sitting here far away from home. There is no cake and no candles. Just wish him, please. Everybody, please stand up and wish him a really happy birthday.
Check.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Yeah, he didn't let any of us know, so this is our revenge.
We should ask for the party now.
Yeah, I thought we were starting the session on a great note because we had knocked out the voice of commercial fiction out here. Okay. But usually the way a session on commercial versus literary fiction goes is we go over a range of well-worn arguments. Commercial bestsellers are eating up the space. There isn't the same kind of room for literary writers anymore. A lot of what's published in the name of bestsellers is fairly low on quality, etc., etc., and it turns into a wine fest, which is not what we are here to do. So I want to start by just asking the gentleman on either side of me to talk for about a couple of minutes about the books that they themselves read, have loved, and have read over the years. How much of that would be commercial? How much of that would be literary? And in the interest of full disclosure, my interests are commonly assumed to be high literary, and it is true that I do read things like the epics and the classics. But I admit to this as shamefacedly as somebody might, admit to reading Savita Bhabhi episodes online. But I also inherited my grandmother's collection of Mills and Boons, a love for old school Bengali detective fiction. And I like pulp. I married a man for the sake of his science fiction pulp library, in effect. He doesn't know this, and thankfully he's not listening right now, so I'm getting away with this little bit of information. But that's just the one way of saying that I think our reading lives are pretty vast. They cross over into both territories fairly seamlessly, and I'm going to put that to the test now by asking first David and then Kapish what they read when they're at home.
Yeah, well, I think I think that's absolutely correct. I think it is almost impossible to put readers into boxes. Yes, I'm sure there are people who read only literary books, and I'm sure there are people who read only commercial books. But speaking for myself, I've been a general publisher all my life. All the companies I've worked for have published have published books across the spectrum, from commercial books to literary books. But before I was a publisher, I was a reader, right from the time I was little. And I've read books for entertainment. I've read books for improvement. I've read books for a variety of purposes. And I think I read books that are well written, books that I read for story, books that I read for because of things that they can teach me. And so they would fall under the category of completely commercial and books that are high literary. So, I see no contradiction between the two. So, in my mind, both coexist and have always coexisted.
This is alarming. We're hoping you're going to disagree. But what was your reading like? I mean, do you have a set of standards? Do you divide your reading mentally into commercial, literary, anything of the sort?
See, I think the first thing is my reading as a publisher and my reading as a reader are two different things. Reading as a publisher, I have to do what my job entails, which is finding good commercial writing and publishing that. Reading for pleasure is a completely separate thing, so I have to have that clear distinction in my roles when I'm reading for profession or reading for pleasure. So when it comes for pleasure, I'm rereading The Tipping Point on the flight here, Malcolm Gladwell. I'm reading an autobiography of a politician we're going to be publishing soon. And I'm also reading a proposal of commercial fiction that's come to us from an author. But there is a mix of what I'm reading for pleasure as well as what I'm reading for profession. Having said so, I think I tend to agree with what David is saying. Commercial writing and literary writing can coexist in the same space, in the same bucket. Today's bestseller charts are actually the best indication of that. You have on the same bestseller charts, and I'm shamelessly plugging Rupa and Aleph here, 33% of those bestseller charts are, dominated by both the companies combined. And which is testimony to the fact that there is readership for both the categories. I think this is a notion that we have, and I was mentioning this to you, Nilanjana, a short while ago. For me, there is only one definition. Either you have a successful book or you have an unsuccessful book. Everything else is a byproduct. Literary, commercial, pulp, Chiclet, DIY, I don't know, FII, whatever. But yeah, really it's successful or unsuccessful.
Okay, so we are moving it away from what used to be hypothetically, the way that publishing is supposed to work the world over, though I don't know how often it's actually worked that way, is that you think of publishers as noble people who go out to look for the greatest books, the next writers who will define their generation. And in a sense, what commercial and literary fiction do, I mean, I'm aware that there's a huge overlap between both categories. But what they do are completely different things. And I want you to both go back. You've been watching the Indian publishing scene for a while. One of my hypotheses was that we haven't actually seen a boom in commercial writing in English so much as English has caught up with other mainstream Indian languages. I cannot think of a major Indian language that hasn't always had a thriving pulp or commercial side to it, whether it's Bengali, Malayalam, Tamil. But 20 years back, 30 years ago, to where we are now, what would you say the difference is? Both in terms of the bestseller charts, the kind of authors who are getting published right now. What do you think has changed?
See, I'd like to pick up on something that you said. You can have the greatest books in the artificial genres that, publishers put or, newspapers put on bestseller lists. You can have the best books in the commercial space. You can have the best books in the literary space. For me, Kapish was talking about, books that work and books that don't work. I would take it a little further. I would extend that definition of books that work and books that don't work. He was talking about it in terms of books that work in the marketplace. I would also extend that definition into books that work in terms of themselves. I mean, I think in terms of the craft. I mean, I think there are a detective novel that works as a great detective novel. There are sloppy detective novels. There are sloppy literary novels. I mean, I think that needs to be looked at as well. You cannot, for example, sell a dud book. You cannot sell a really poor detective novel, no matter how much marketing dollars you put behind it. The same way you cannot sell a bad literary novel. But there are good literary novels that fail, and there are good detective novels that fail, right? Now, to answer the question that you put to us, yes, I think the marketplace has changed a lot. I think India, when compared to other marketplaces in the world today, is probably a little bit more interesting and a little bit more exciting than, say, North America or the UK. I'm talking about English language marketplaces at the moment, because those markets are suffering a lot more than we are, because they are mature markets that are now suffering from the fact that they're mature markets, and there isn't much scope to expand there. here you are looking at a market that is a very immature market that is starting to mature. So you're seeing a multiplicity of genres sort of starting to develop. It will take another 15 or 20 years before it reaches its fullest maturity. It started from a very small base, so it is still expanding. We are now, caught up in the choppy surf of bad management of the economy, blah, blah, blah. So we'll have to sort of pass through that. But despite all of that, it's still growing. There's a bunch of things that exist today that didn't exist 20 years ago when I started, for example. When pretty much everything that was published was literary or faux literary. Today you have Chetan Bhagat, you have romance writers, you have detective novelists, etc., etc. And tomorrow you will have science fiction and so on and so forth in the English language, which I think is great.
And just to change the question to you slightly, because I think David's done a very thorough job of answering that. There are two aspects to the rise of the Indian English language bestseller. One is just the exhilaration of having books out there that talk in a language that people understand. Not just first-generation Indians coming to English as their language, but I know so many people from the small towns who find these books easier to relate to, and who, to a certain extent, if you're coming to reading for the first time, what are you going to look at? You want books that speak back to you. That's one argument. The other argument, are there no standards at all? In what we are calling commercial publishing, are there editorial standards? Are you looking at good grammar?
Are we discussing, there is that romance of, vis-a-vis the image of a publisher. You go out, you find an author, their dusty manuscripts, and you go and publish it, and, it's success. There's a certain romance with that idea. And then the romance goes out of the window the moment you look at the commercial aspect of the business, which is the business of publishing. And I use the word business before publishing, and in that context, because there is creative monetization and there's creativity. So I think the space where I come from, I'm very clear about the fact that I come from a space of creative monetization. And therefore, that leads me to the next point, which is to answer your question, are there any standards at all? Is anything that will sell? Does it work? Actually, no. And therefore, there are times that we do get manuscripts that we feel that could probably sell X number of copies or Y, but the bar is really low, and the bar is not really low because it's written improperly, or there's wrong grammar, or there's syntax problem, whatever. Sometimes the plot is not good, so there can be a bad book, but it could still have a possible market because it may have a very straight line target audience, but the content may not be strong enough. So having said so, yes, there are times you have to say no to certain kinds of books. But also there's this discussion up in the air, isn't it? Who sets the bar? Do you set the bar? Do I set the bar? Does the reader set the bar? What standards do we judge by? Because are numbers the only standards? Is profile a certain standard? Are those standards objective? So there are many such questions that are unanswered. So for me, I like to make my life a little simple. So I say, if there is a book that we can do justice to, that we can either sell well or it can be a game changer for us, let's go ahead and do it. And we'll worry about the definitions later.
And what do you think of literary books? I mean, the books that are called... I find this a very troublesome category, frankly, dividing books into literary and commercial, particularly with regard to the literary label on things. But how shall we put it? Books that are not obviously bestsellers, but that you have or your firm has backed.
No, I don't think... See, I think that's where the biggest misconception is. Literary books can be and are bestsellers. So... just because it's a literary book, it cannot be a bestseller is a misconceived notion that a lot of people have. And I want to clear that up once and for all. We published books in the Aleph brand that we've sold 25,000 copies in hardcover in about 4 months. And we published books in paperback in Rupa that we've sold 100,000 copies in paperback in about 3 months. So just because you're literary, you will sell less is a completely wrong notion.
Oh, sorry.
So I believe that I think it has to be a good book, whichever category, and if there is great writing, and if there's a definite audience for it, and if it's marketed well, the numbers will happen. And how do the numbers happen? I mean, let's take a step back. Numbers are basically a representation of the fact that there is a readership out there who's appreciated the book, who's liked the book, and who's bought it for a certain reason. That in itself is a validation of the book, of the fact that something like that was put out.
Can I take both of you back to different moments in your careers when you went through the thrill of discovering that an author whom you'd taken a bet on, the most famous example for you might be Chetan Bhagat, the most famous for David might be Vikram Seth, I'm guessing out here. I won't stick with these. I mean, please come up with other names if you feel that fits. But the moment when you realize that an author or a book is working with the public, and not just that, in both cases, I picked out those names for a reason, because when Chetan's book started to take off, that actually didn't herald the start of a new kind of writing. It ushered in a new kind of reading, in a sense. There was a generation showing up, even when you looked at the census numbers and you saw that English was suddenly the fastest growing language in India. That was also what was being captured. And again, Vikram Seth came up at a certain moment in Indian writing. He was one of the first confident voices. He was one of the first writers to write completely on his own terms, not to a Western audience, but he wrote with complete confidence. He didn't feel the need to translate himself. And apologies if these are the wrong examples, but could you just talk a little bit about that? What does it feel? It doesn't have to be, you might pick something out of the supposedly commercial world, and Kapish might choose something completely different from the literary world. Just what does it feel like to be present at that moment when you see that a market and a world is changing?
Well, I think Vikram was an interesting example because he, like you said, I was having an argument yesterday, not an argument, a conversation with somebody at the dinner table where I said if, for example, the so-called elites in India who came of age after independence, because the reason I picked that moment in time was because presumably we were the first without any baggage, right? If we'd been schooled in a different way, if we went to different universities, etc., etc., if I, for example, had used Tamil as a first language, as opposed to English as a first language, and knew Valluvar's couplets better than Shakespeare, would I have, looked at the world differently? Vikram, for example, wrote against the grain. If he'd followed the prevailing fashion of the time, he would not have written a suitable boy. I started publishing him with a very small book of poems, which sold, 2,000, 3,000 copies or whatever. And then he wrote, his next book was A Suitable Boy, which then went on to sell, God knows, zillions of copies around the world and made his name, so to speak. But that was, an old-fashioned 19th century novel, which was, I think, or still is the longest novel in the English language or whatever. And he was adamantly he refused to shorten it. He and I decided, actually it was not us, Rushdie had already made that decision. We decided not to italicize a single Indian word. There were no translations, no glossary, nothing. That was quite a overtly political act, because at that point most Indian novels still had glossaries, etc., especially novels published around the world. There's lots of small acts of subversion, if you like, and it worked, so to speak, because of what the book was, and so we go back to, in a very subjective world, there have to be a few objective facts, which is the work of art has to be the best it possibly can be. And then hopefully we professionals, publishing professionals, need to get our act together and do what it is that we do, and so on and so forth. And at that point, certain definitions, literary, commercial, etc., sort of fall away, and then you go forward.
I think Chetan is an interesting example. I remember I was 19 or 20 when I read the 5 Point somewhere around that age, and I remember this was the first or the second draft, and it was a Saturday evening. I started reading this at about 7-8 p.m. and I finished it at about 2 a.m. in the morning, and I went up to my father the next day and I said, I think we can do something here. I can't shake off the feeling. This is very much a story that I can relate to, because this is my age group. The protagonist is completely something that one can relate to. And we went, and I had a generous father who said, okay, don't spoil my Sunday morning, and we went ahead with 5,000 copies to start with, and the rest, as they say, is history. We reached a point where we're selling 1 million copies, one copy every 31 seconds, etc., etc. But the point I'm making here is that one has to, because what you asked is actually very important. There are times and moments in the publishing's, in the publishing timeline where certain things will work and certain things won't. Chetan Bhagat happened to come at a certain point in time when everything worked, because you had the 3 generations of English-speaking Indians, you had a certain new culture brewing in the country, you had a new sort of readership. There was the Delhi, the Bombay, and the Madras, but also the Bilaspur, the Banaras, and the Dibrugarh reading. So there was a lot of that happening. And if you just park that example for a second, I see that happening because we also sell across the globe now. I see that happening very much today in Philippines, for example. Philippines is an American colony. It's always had a certain kind of readership. And today, with the introduction of the BPO culture, 18-year-olds, 20-year-olds earning about 20,000 rupees, 25,000 rupees, I see that a lot of commercial writing is taking over, and I see that happening. Because I think commercial writing also at a certain level is entertainment, entertainment packaged at an effective price. I mean, I see Piyush here. Piyush is one of our successful authors in the crime space, and we published 2 of his books. We've been reasonably successful, and I feel proud of the fact that we've been able to start something like that. So definitely there are moments that that will happen, but everything has to work at the same time. It can't happen in isolation.
But again, I'm seeing 2 different and very interesting standards out here. One of them is a standard familiar to me from the only 2 Indian languages I read, which are Bengali and Hindi. And where, Anundu Publishers in Bengal, one of the largest, and they just obliterate the divide between commercial and literary. They just publish both in large numbers and that's it. But they and a lot of the Hindi language publishers used to talk about the importance of having authors whom people relate to, which is what seems to be right now the direction that the Indian English language bestseller is taking. And you talked about the other standard, which is wanting a book to be the best that it can be. And I think that if there is a divide between the 2 spaces, this is really where it is, which is that you might want to define a book as literary if that's what its ambition is, to be really the best in terms of form, in terms of craft. But on the other hand, the commercial writer might equally say that my job is different. My job is to write a story that doesn't just have mass appeal. I mean, I've heard Durjoy Datta and Ravinder Singh and various other authors talking about this. And they really feel that their job is only to connect, to make that, one-to-one relationship. Chetan, again, I think takes that very seriously, We are also talking about just a handful of writers in the bestseller sphere. And one of the things I really wanted to ask you about, because I've been doing some numbers and what they show up is pretty interesting.
See, I don't know that there are numbers here, but I know in the West it's definitely much higher for commercial fiction. Because I know that there are published statistics there, and the kind of philosophy is publish a lot, knowing that a lot are going to fail. So it's a kind of conveyor belt kind of approach, or a scattershot approach. Publish 100, 2 will succeed. Whereas literary fiction is you publish a lot less. I don't know about here.
I think, again, there will be commercial. So, actually commercial is unfortunately the wrong term that we have. It has many meanings and connotations. So commercial writing doesn't necessarily mean revenue generating writing. It doesn't necessarily mean best-selling writing. It doesn't necessarily mean huge number of copies. If it does all of that, I'm a happy man. It's mass market. So there are books in the mass market space which are game changers but may not sell a lot of copies. So first, let's sort of rub that off the table. That's very important because so there are successes and failures in both. Having said that, is the degree of failure higher in commercial? I think from a getting published perspective, probably yes, because I know at Rupa we get about 10 to 12 manuscripts every day. And the thing that one keeps saying, at the moment one gets a mic, is that please don't copy a formula. It doesn't work. Commercial writing is not that simple. It is an art just as literary writing is. It is about connecting to the reader, absolutely. But it's actually telling a great story in a great style. And that is it's a craft by itself, and if you copy a formula, it won't work. So you have to be original and or still operate in the space that you need to operate in, which is a certain style of writing, which is a language, which is the tone, and then the plot. I mean, the plot is incidental, really, but I mean, all of the above, yes.
Okay, I've fallen into the trap that I promised myself I wouldn't, which is we haven't talked about commercial nonfiction or literary nonfiction at all, And in a way, I think that we're thinking about very large things out here. But there, perhaps, it's actually easier to see a dividing line between literary and mass market, The whole question that we started with, can these books occupy the same space? I would say that in terms of literary nonfiction versus mass market nonfiction, this is just my opinion, but probably absolutely not. Those books want to do even more different things than mass market fiction versus literary fiction. I don't know whether there's a versus out here to begin with.
I don't think there is. How would you classify a book on tigers?
It depends on who's writing it, really.
Yeah. Honestly, I think popular is as popular goes. There is diet books fulfill a certain need, a book on high philosophy, etc., etc. I think at the end of the day, there are books that are written that will be read by a wider by a large number of readers, and there are books that will be read by a few number of readers, depending on how abstruse the subject is. I think that's as far as you can go. Again, literary fiction or literary subjects are a genre when you come down to it. That's the way I look at it. It's a specialist subject. At the end of the day, as publishers, Rupa, Penguin, the very large houses are general publishing companies. And then there are specialist publishers like Aleph. Aleph publishes in a genre, which is within a larger group, etc. That's the way we look at it as publishing professionals, I think. And as readers, you are free to choose. I think that's the only way to look at it. And today, I think, and as writers as well, there are people who decide what they're going to write about.
Kapish, do you want to respond to that? Otherwise, I did have another question, and it's slightly, now that we've reached this happy wave of agreement and that we know that mass market books are doing really well, by and large, publishers that can expect to turn a slightly bigger profit than they might have maybe 15, 20 years ago. Or at least there's a sense of the market expanding to new readers. Why is it that general trade publishers do so little to support that side of books known as the really literary side? Why is it that there's so little poetry, so little in the way of plays? This is this is an old complaint. Consider me just the person who's forwarding the letter to the editors, so to speak.
I don't think, as I said, I have no pretensions of being a businessman who's running a publishing house. That's who I am. I will publish poetry tomorrow if I feel there's a certain quality in poetry and there's a readership for it. Today I feel hesitant about doing it because it's not that we don't experiment. We do poetry books, maybe 2 or 3 in the year. We do anthologies, which is again another point of argument. We do translation as well. So there are times when we go back and say, there are certain things we should be doing because we're not just running a business. This is not just, producing buckets. But then we do go back and also to the table and analyze the numbers and say, maybe there is not such a great pickup. Is that because the translation quality is not that good? I don't know. Is that because people don't want to buy as much poetry in hard copy format as well as in digital? I don't know. But we do keep experimenting. And actually, honestly, I have no problem publishing poetry, short stories, anthologies, translation. If all the experiments we do, if 3 of them fire out of 5, it's perfectly all right for me to do that.
David, do you think Indian publishing in English does enough of that? Because this is the one big complaint that you get back from authors, that publishers won't take that kind of risk.
Well, publishers don't make enough money to take that kind of risk. I think in most countries, there are either private benefactors or the state councils support the publishing of poetry. We don't have that. We absolutely need to have that. I think the Sahitya Academy does some of that, and there are some other Gyanpith I think does a bit of it. But some largesse could come the way of private publishers as well. And that's one way of getting us to publish poetry. But we don't make enough profit to be able to sort of divert some of it towards the publishing of something which would absolutely not make us money. I mean, for example, we will publish maybe 1 or 2 poetry books a year, as Kapish said, but that's nowhere near as much as needs to be done. So.
Yeah, that's
And
pretty
I
honest.
think just to add to what David said, I think there's a very important point he's made. We don't have in this country a comprehensive national book policy. We consider ourselves the fastest growing English language market. We are number 3 in the world in the pecking order. But this country does not have a national book policy. Now, the national book policy has to be related to infrastructure to publishers. It has to be related to, supporting certain ventures, like you said. Because publishers will be publishers. They will be running a business. They will make the decisions that are profitable, etc., profile, etc., in that order. But there is no policy. However, if you look at countries towards the east, I'm focusing my attention, and I've chosen for no particular reason to focus my attention towards the east. If you look at Malaysia, if you look at Indonesia, there is a lot of support that's given. And I'm not saying dole out cash, but I'm just saying that there needs to be systemic program that says, okay, we will encourage this kind of writing, and this is how we will support it. Unfortunately, with due respect to the powers that be, it doesn't exist.
This is fair enough, because I remember in my brief foray into publishing, one of the saddest problems was the lack of actual infrastructure. Whether you're talking libraries or whether you're talking good bookstore networks, a lot of that was missing, and that automatically cut down on what you could do. But I have one last question for you, and then we're going to throw it open to the audience, and that's the English mass market bestseller. Is it really responsible for the death of the Hindi pulp fiction industry? Because I hear that often from publishers, and Mehra particularly. They say, no, it's all their fault. The fact that they're cross-translating their bestsellers into Hindi right now is killing our market.
I think absolutely not. I mean, sorry, because we just did the experiment. So we started with, a short, success. We published Bhagat in Hindi. So we did Revolution 2020, and we did 2 states in Hindi at a gap of 6 months. All his other the previous 3 books have been licensed out to Hindi language publishers. Now, with due respect to them, the numbers weren't very high, and we began to think to ourselves, why so? Because here's a guy who's selling $1 million+ a year, and why are we just selling 5,000 in Hindi? So we took it upon ourselves and published it. And what we did away was, the book is called Revolution 2020. It's not called something else. Yeah, it's not Inqilab Zindabad or whatever. It's called 2 states. It's not called Do Rajya. It does not have Yadyapi and Tathastu. It is normal colloquial Hindi, and vice versa. And we've sold 25,000, 30,000 copies of those books in the same market where we are trying to find it difficult. Because again, the problem is not Hindi. The problem is, what language are you speaking to the reader? Because that reader who's picking up the Hindi book today is not necessarily, from the commercial perspective, the Yadapi and the Tathastu kind of reader. So therefore, keep that in mind. And I think that is somewhere a little bit, and I can't stand up and sort of raise my hand and say this is the absolutely right thing to do. But I know that there's something that we're going wrong. That's point 1. And point 2, I think Hindi is a very big market. I mean, it's appalling to look at the numbers for a Hindi newspaper vis-a-vis an English newspaper. And same thing for English publishing and Hindi, which is completely the inverted cone. And I feel that there is a much larger audience, but we don't have a structured Hindi bookselling network. I mean, there are only 2 or 3 strong networks, and then there are the mom and pop shops, which is not the case in English. Yes, Flipkart and the other online portals sell Hindi, but is that the form and formula to reach out to the Hindi reader? Maybe not. So I think that is also something. Is the conduit enough? So, so that's what I...
No, that's a great point, actually, because that feeds into the idea that there are also now many different kinds of English publishing. And, with Hindi and Bengali and Tamil, Malayalam, a lot of these languages, there's a sense that the market hasn't caught up. The publishing houses are just as big as they ever were. You've got good editors. You even have good writers still, but there's a lack of market infrastructure. I hear that all the time from everywhere. Sorry, we're going on a bit on a hobby
I
horse.
haven't a clue.
Okay.
I think it's a time warp thing. Sometimes, one does deal with a lot of them, and some of them are reinventing the wheel, and which is great. But some of them, I really sometimes push the envelope and say, you have to accept today that the reader is not, even the Bengali reader is not the same Bengali reader he was. Look at the newspaper language. The newspaper language of 20 years ago of Anandabazar Patrika and compared to today is very different. So you have to talk to your audience in the language that they understand, whether it's English, Hindi, Marathi, Bengali, whatever. And it will work. But then you have to talk to them in that language. And I'm not saying I can decide that language. I'm saying the market, the customer, the reader will decide it automatically. I can't decide it.
That's a good point. And we're going to move it into the audience right now. Does anyone have a question? I see a hand up right there. Can one of us sacrifice a mic? And we'll try and take as many questions as possible. So just keep your questions brief, if you don't mind my saying so, just so that we have room for everybody. There's that gentleman, and then there's the gentleman in the pink shirt. There's the one in the gray, right in front.
Hi, my question is not about commercial or literary per se. It's about audiobooks, especially audiobooks in non-English Indian languages. Is there anything happening on that front? Because someone like me, I may want to listen to a Hindi book, whereas I might not be fluent enough to read them. Something like Audible, where it can be delivered onto your mobile phones.
I think the audiobook is a great space to operate in. It's a very valid point. There is, the best of my knowledge, there is Hindi audiobooks that's happening. There are a couple of such products out there. But I think we haven't touched upon this. Yes, audiobooks is an emerging market. Surprisingly so, a lot of people had written it off, saying, audiobooks won't sell, who will hear it, etc., etc. But I think the entire digital revolution has changed it, and I think audiobooks is an important market, and definitely in the regional language space, it could be even bigger.
Hi. Sorry, can I go ahead? Well, commercial fiction, fine. Literary fiction, fine. Nobody's mentioned trash fiction, which seems to be written by some kind of primate with the basic knowledge of the alphabet, bashing away at a keyboard, and that gets published and it gets sold. Mm-hmm. Now, my question to you is, do publishers not have a responsibility to hold a certain standard of the language, particularly because young people are reading this trash fiction? Okay, since I have limited time, let me add to that another question. What about literary agencies? Would publishers prefer to have works referred through literary agencies, which are pretty much non-existent here? And sorry, with apologies, thirdly, do you think e-publishing is going to take over here or not? Thank you. So 3 things.
Sorry. Well, in terms of trash publishing, you can't prevent it because now anyone who uploads books online can be read by anybody who wants to download their writing. So publishers are no longer the gatekeepers. With the internet, anyone can put up what they write and anyone can download it. So that's pretty much, there are no filters anymore. In terms of literary agents, there are now quite a few in India. You can find them on by just Googling them. Their numbers are growing. There aren't enough, but there are many more than used to exist about 10 or 15 years ago. And what was your third question? What was the third question? Yeah, e-publishing at the moment, it's between 1% to 5% in terms of e-downloads. At the moment, the only place in the world where it's made a significant impact is in North America, where it's up to 30% of sales in some formats. In Europe, it's slightly less. In India, at the moment, it's negligible, but we don't know. Nobody can predict how quickly it's going to gain traction. So 2 years from now, it might be up to 10 or 15%. All our books are available as ebooks simultaneously with with first publication. So we're ready for ebooks as and when it reaches a critical point. From our point of view, we don't mind in what format readers read. We see it as another format. We just want people to read our books.
Just to add to that, I think I'll start at third and then go on to 1 second. You already answered. So third is e-books. I think it's about exactly as what he said, 1 to 5%. But there are two important factors here. The rate of growth is about 20 to 25% quarter to quarter, which is a very healthy rate of growth in the e-book space. I think that is also because we've got our entire backlist digitized. As we publish a frontlist title, it's available simultaneously at almost the same price. So there is suddenly a huge audience that we've opened up the books to, who can immediately get it, the NRI audience, etc., even the Indian audience that we are catering to. So the rate of growth is phenomenal, and there is also a pricing advantage that we should remember, because we used to be selling a book at 195 or 150 or whatever, but when you're selling in the US market, you're selling it for 9.99 or 14.99. So there's a huge markup that exists. So the profitability goes up by 20x. So even if we sell less volume, but there's high value. So that's on the ebook front. Trash literature, I think David's pretty much covered it all. But, I don't think it's for us to decide as publishers, what's trash or not. I think that's exactly what a reader should be doing, and deciding what's not good and what's good, and junk what's not good. We are essentially supposed to, by sort of dumbing down the definition, but really messengers of writing. And beyond that, that's where our role ends.
Okay, I have to say that this is one of the areas where I do disagree, actually. It's alarmingly, not just your argument, because I've heard a lot of publishing houses make this across the world, and it's alarmingly like the arguments made by the junk food industry in America, who say, well, we make chips and we produce junk food because the market exists. It's all the market's fault. So at some point of time, I think for all publishers, the point is that they're stuck. If you're looking at any emerging readership right now, whether it's in the East or the West, you are looking at a lot of junk coming out. And to a certain extent, somebody is going to have to draw the line and say, I'm sorry, but a lot of this really is garbage, particularly in terms of the kind of Englishes or the kind of language abuse that happens out there. But I don't see a point right now where any major publisher, any trade publisher, actually has the luxury. That is the ugly side of it. I don't think there are too many trade publishers who have the luxury of turning away from that market very easily.
I think junk food increases calorie counts and cholesterol. Trash fiction or whatever fiction doesn't.
That's for your mind.
No, it's so there is that argument as well, junk food versus trash fiction. But yeah, fair point. There is a lot of content floating out there, and there will be people who may not be appreciative of that content, which is a perfectly fine argument. And that time will come, and that time will not be decided by us. That time will not be decided by people sitting here. That will be decided by the people sitting there. It will be decided by the people who will have to buy it and who will say at one point in time, hey, this is enough, we don't want it. And in certain categories, I see that time that has already happened. I won't take names because it's not correct to do so, but I do know a certain style of writing and which specific to certain styles of certain publishing houses is not being accepted as much as it was 2 years ago. So these points will come automatically. You and I can't decide those points. The consumer will, and he already or she already is. So
Kapish's point is market evolution. As you get more sophisticated readers, they will start demanding higher levels. Okay, that is, we're just going to have to see how that plays out. I can't really see hands up right now, but I can see a couple here, and the mics in the middle out there right now, and there are 2 hands that I can see up here.
As a reader, you see certain books everywhere. They seem to pop up in the front of bookstores. They're being reviewed. They're being reviewed in all the newspapers and magazines. So I'm wondering whether it's commercial, mass market, or literary fiction, how much of a book's success is determined by how publishers are promoting it, how much money or what channels?
A lot.
Thank you.
yeah, I think it certainly you have to see. Okay, let's go back in time a bit. We as a country were publishing maybe about 15 new books a year. About amongst the major Indian language, English language, Indian publishers, English language major publishers in this country, about 40, 50 new books a month. Now there are about 200 new books a month. So but the retail space hasn't sort of gone up by 5x or whatever. So there is that fight for retail space, which is a constant battle. One of the biggest nightmares that I have is an email from any author saying, my book wasn't available at that store. And that's a perfectly valid argument because it should be. But unfortunately, the nature of the industry is such, the nature of selling is such that there is a push effect and there's a pull effect. So the push effect is certainly decided by the publisher. You put in a certain amount of money and you hope that it will run on its own after a certain point in time. But you have to put in that money. But after a point in time, it also has to run on its own. So, it has to be a bit of both.
Good evening, sir. I'm Namita here. I'm an amateur author, basically looking forward to get my book out into the open market with the help of a publisher. Now, when I seek a publisher, like for example, when I go to the website of Rupa Publications and when I consult them with how to make a submission, it is required that we send a synopsis and sample chapters, which are reviewed in a span of 3 months, and then I get to know whether you accept or reject the book. What exactly are those criteria that you consider in 3 chapters that makes you decide that this book might or might not have the required potential?
It's a very good question. Again, shamelessly plugging ourselves, the website says 3 months, but we usually get back in about 4 to 6 weeks. So that's one. Two, yeah, there is only that much you can look at and take a call on. And there is, yes, there could be more effective methods of doing this. Yes, we should be looking at the entire manuscript. But is it really possible? We live in a finite world. We don't live in an ideal world. So in those three chapters and a synopsis, we hope that the experts who are looking at it should get a fair idea of originality of idea of continuity of thought. There is a target audience. So originality of idea, continuity of thought, and the target audience. These are 3 very important parameters for us to be able to think and choose whether we want to even look at the complete manuscript. And I hope because our people look at about 100 and 150 manuscripts a week, they are looking at it carefully.
Okay, now suppose a manuscript is sent back, that is just the sample chapters, and work is done on the background on that particular book wherein people are actually reacting on a very positive note that they want to read more of the manuscript and what the other excerpts are. In that case, what exactly would you suggest me to do? Can I revert back to the publishing house saying that, yes, my book does have potential, please take some further look on it? Or
it's happened with us. There are many occasions, and I don't want to mention names of books that have actually gotten published and become successful, which have come to us, and we've written back to the author and said, listen, it doesn't work for us in this format. There are certain things we'd like you to change. Please consider them, and if you still would like to resubmit, we'd happy to take a look. So authors have done that and written back to us and said, we've done what you wanted us to do. We've at least tried to have a look, and does it work now? And there have been times where we've said yeses, and there are times where we've said no's. So there is that, and we're fairly open about it.
thank you.
Thanks a lot. Just to ask everybody to keep it to one question only. If you have a supplementary to ask, just buttonhole both publishers after the session. Sorry, but this is just so that we can get in as many questions as possible. Thanks.
Good evening. Hello. Good evening. This is more of an observation throughout this session from morning till evening. This fear about the next generation, that is the immediate generation, not reading literary works, and the advent of e-books, or not e-books, audiobooks. Where does it stand is what I'm trying to... Will the audiobooks take over this knowledge of literary books, and that's the fear there. People are not reading literature, books. They are more into audio these days because of shortage of time and travel and whatever. They download it on their mobile and they don't read enough literature. This again affecting the language. You have got this SMS culture coming up and all this. This is the fear. How do you address this? The e-audio, which is specifically I'm addressing, versus literature.
I don't think anyone has been able to form any definitive conclusions. I mean, everyone has a theory. Everyone has, you can read as much learned comment on this as your brain can hold. Every publisher on the planet has an opinion. I read commentaries every single day. And I'm still none the wiser. Until my sales go down, or until I see any definitive dip in, my business, I'm going to just keep publishing. And I think that is true of everybody. In North America, it hasn't gone down. It's still stable. So that is the most effective, because that is where, in South Korea, which is the most wired country on the planet, they're still publishing books. I don't think we need to worry.
Also, just to add to that, format does not decide commercial literary. There will be people who would read a literary book on as an e-book, or would prefer to listen to it as an audio, and there'll be the vice versa as well. I don't think we should confuse the format vis-a-vis the genre. I think they're two separate things, and I can tell you, as far as we are concerned, we have certain flashpoints that we keep observing, where we've seen that in certain weeks in the ebook space particularly, because that's a data you can track today. There has been a commercial book which has taken #1 spot, and there have been weeks that has been literary book has taken the #1 spot. So actually, it's not really the vehicle. It's and honestly, as publishers, after a certain point of time, I would be happy to say it doesn't matter. I mean, for us, we're publishing books, whether they publish as paper books, as e-books, audiobooks, as long as there's the word books after that, we hope to remain in business.
And just to say that I don't think it's dumbing down so much as it's widening out. This is the most text-based generation we've ever had. The one fear in India is a completely different fear, which is that we're losing bilingualism and we might be losing our own languages. That's a legitimate worry. But I wouldn't actually worry too much about this. I would say that every single generation has worried about people losing touch with literature of a certain kind or losing touch with the classics. And somehow the classics survive. Somehow every generation seems to discover a new set of books that are important to them. It's just that you're looking at a much wider pool of readers than you have been in any other given century, and that skews people's perceptions. I mean, that would just be my take on it.
Hi. As a publisher, what are the common mistakes you've seen in the manuscripts of a first-time author? Say like cliches or something.
I think, that's actually an excellent question, because I think the problem is one of the worst cliches that exists is that somebody somewhere said that everyone has a book in them. So sadly, everybody does think that they have a book in them. So, everyone sits down and writes their life story and sends it to us. The fact that you can run doesn't mean that you think that you can beat Usain Bolt at the 100-meter sprint, right? You feel you have to train, et cetera, before you think you can become an Olympic athlete. So why does everyone think that they can write a novel which can be published? That, I think, is the problem. Not everyone who sits down to write a novel actually prepares, actually trains to write a novel. I think that is the biggest problem we face. People don't do their homework. People don't figure out what it takes to write a novel. I think that is the biggest cliche there is. They just sit down and start writing. 6 months later, they figure they have a novel and they send it to us.
And in one line, I think it's just like any other presentation that you send to anybody else for anything. It has to be perfect. It should be, all the things that David said, but it should just be just like any other presentation that you send to anybody else. So, yeah.
Thanks a lot. I think we're out of time. The next session has to start, but thank you so much for the questions you've asked. And if you want to speak to Kapish and David, Kapish, I think, has a flight to catch. But David might be around if you can catch him and wish him. And no one can actually speak to him without offering him cake. But apart from that small thing, thank you.